Hello and welcome to On Point. I'm Jackie Wawee. More and more women are participating in sports today, but you wouldn't exactly know that if you've watched any sports channel on TV. In 2014, SportsCenter gave only about 2% of their airtime to women's sports, and that's been a consistent number for over a decade. Sports journalists may argue that they are giving their audience what they want and that the demand for women's coverage isn't as great, but most sports journalists are men. Some CSUN students say they've noticed the difference in coverage of men and women athletes.
When I had my games, we really didn't get a lot of attention just because people have this stereotype that it's not going to be as interesting.
And you see the huge difference, and not just wages. Look at the advertisements, you look at TV, you hear about all men's sports, because usually in the past 100,000 years, men are the dominant.
I wouldn't want to go to a WNBA game over an NBA game, you know? It's a little more physical, I guess.
Maybe after this interview, I'll keep an eye out on women's sports.
A USC study says in 1989, 5% of TV news media covered female sports, but in 2014, the percentage decreased to 3.2%. So with Title IX and the increase in female participation, why is the coverage still decreasing? On Point's Alicia Dieguez has more.
Thank you, Jackie. Today we have guests Hanna Levanen, former student athlete, kinesiology professor Chris Bolsmann, and CSUN's Associate Athletics Director Dawn Ellerbe. So I wanted to start off with a very specific question, and it goes as this. Although now more than ever before, more women play sports, why do you think only 4% of all sport media coverage is on female athletes and sports? This is open to all of you.
You know, I have this conversation with my family all the time, and I sound, as a female, a little male chauvinistic when I say that it is true that oftentimes males as, sex are more strong physically than females. And that's not always the case, of course. You have very elite level athletes who are very, very strong. But when you do compare the best female athletes in a certain sport to the best male athletes in that same sport, oftentimes you do see that the males are performing better than the females. And I think that that's just, everybody in the viewing part of that wanting to see something exciting. That's what my opinion of that is, yeah.
I have a slightly different take on it. I think your statistic is interesting, but I think we need to look at the number of girls and women that are participating in sport in the United States. And that figure is around 40%. So if we've got only 4% coverage, for me it suggests what is taking place is just a replication of inequality within society more generally. I think sport is a really interesting vehicle or lens to look at society. And if we look at the patriarchal nature of our society and more recently the misogynistic nature of our society, I think that is a reflection of that more generally.
I think the media coverage is skewed. I think we have, if 40% of our student athletes, I'm speaking of college athletics, are female and playing sports, I think the demand to see them on TV has to grow. And I think that starts kind of at the grassroots level. If you look at the March Madness, and that's the highest viewership for women's basketball on TV is during March Madness. And that plays because men's basketball is so popular. Now women's basketball is growing and becoming popular too. As we grow, we see half of our men's games are on TV, and only a quarter of our women's games are on TV. So as we start to increase the demand for women's sports to be on TV, we'll start to see more on television. But we have to, as a public, demand that.
Okay, thank you. And my second question is, when you look at magazines such as Sports Illustrated, ESPN, and even GQ featuring athletes on their covers, what are some differences you see in the way female versus the male athletes are represented?
I'll take that one. If you look at some recent covers, we'll say like ESPN News, if you look, or ESPN Sports, and you look at the recent covers, you always see a female athlete on the cover dressed up, sexualized, looking more like she might be going out for a night on the town than she would playing her sport. And if you look at men on the cover, 9 times out of 10 they're in their uniform, and they're showing off their athletic ability more than they're showing off how attractive they might be. And that's the biggest difference I see. And that's whether it's a glamour magazine or a sports-specific magazine. 9 times out of 10 the woman is dressed in more like a non-athletic gear.
And that's why I do like the body issue. When they do show that on Sports Illustrated, everybody is made so that they are exposed in their raw muscle that they have, and it's not necessarily sexualized in any way because both genders are in the same attire, which is nothing. And I think it's very, very good for everyone to see that, because it's not necessarily how attractive it is or how non-attractive it is. It's about function, and not necessarily the most attractive to one person is how functional that muscle is. And I do think that that's very interesting. A lot of women don't like the bulky legs or the bulky arms, but I mean, especially I used to be a volleyball player. Bulky legs is a great thing for you. You have more jumping power, even though it might not be attractive to whatever population it is. It is important for the function of the sport.
I would add to that, I think we need to look at it also in terms of the history of Sports Illustrated and the number of women that have ever appeared on the cover. And I think the statistic is less than 10%. And 10% of those covers, the majority of those images are invariably sexualized. And I think we need to look at the role of sport more generally. If we think of sport, sport is a representation of masculinity, of power, of muscle. And I think female athletes have this this dilemma, because on the one hand they're expected to be feminine. They are often expected to be sexualized in a certain way, but they also want to be athletes. And how do you become an athlete at the top of your game when you have this contradiction that you're constantly faced with, and that is to appear a certain way for a certain audience or a certain population, but you also want to get to the top of your sport.
It's so true, so true.
Going off on what you said, Dawn, about them being sexualized on the covers, why do you think the female athletes tend to be more sexualized? Especially now when male athletes are being sexualized as well, but you still see this persisting gap.
I think for a female athlete, sometimes we separate as a society the female and the athlete. And I don't think a man ever has to separate being an athlete and being a male. So if a female is maybe, and this is across the board in my opinion, if she is a little bit bigger than average, taller than average, more muscular than average, they tend to want to soften those edges. Where if a male athlete is bigger than average, stronger than average, or more powerful than the average male, that is like what they want to emphasize. So they much rather put that in like the uniform, the big broad shoulders with their shoulder pads on, and they kind of want to soften all those edges that oftentimes participating in sports is tough, and you have to be powerful and you have to be strong. And in our society, those images aren't always synonymous with being female. And I think a lot of times women have to separate being a female and being an athlete.
Yeah, definitely.
My following question. An article by Huffington Post comments that research shows the media's tendency to represent female athletes as sexual objects has actually gone down in the last 3 decades. How true do you think this is?
That's a difficult question to answer. Personally, I do not get my head wrapped up in media regarding how female athletes are looked at. That's just the way I am. I've been very, all my life, just, okay, I'm going to do what I want to do and what makes me happy, and I'm going to lift the weight that I feel best with, and whatever muscle that results in, I know I'm going to feel great from doing it. And I'm very much individualistic, and maybe that has to increase in all female athletes. Focusing on their own path and their own athletic journey will help to increase that view, as you said, about not separating female from athlete and how it's actually one. So, yeah.
This same article was mentioning that this shift of female athletes being objectified as sexual has shifted from sexual objects to mothers and caregivers. How common do you believe this depiction to be?
I think that's probably, there's a lot of truth in that, but I think we have to consider that a woman may not be sexualized in a certain manner, but that what they are doing is they've been categorized in a certain manner, that females are supposed to be caregivers, that females are supposed to raise children, that females are in the more caring professions. And I think this goes back to the original point that I've made, and that is around the issue of gender roles, specific gender roles. And as I've said, sport is a masculine, muscular domain, and women are seen, inverted commas, as these space invaders, these invaders into this masculine space, and by challenging this masculine space, there's a reaction to that, and I think there's a backlash to that. So as much as women can come in and they make a difference, and they challenge these norms, there are only certain kinds of women. So firstly white woman, firstly tall woman, firstly blonde woman. If you think back to the Williams sisters, when the Williams sisters first came onto the scene, there were so many questions around the way they looked, rather than the fact that they're the best tennis players we've ever seen. So I think we need to consider it in terms of structural inequalities in our society more generally.
Thank you. Do you want to add anything to that?
I totally agree with that. I think if we look back to the Rio Olympics that were just this summer, and we especially pay attention to what was going on in the pool, and how we could have a female swimmer who was breaking a record, but the first reference was to her husband, or a female swimmer like Katie Ledecky who had broke the world record, and the headline says Michael Phelps wins his 19th medal, small print, Katie Ledecky breaks world record. Or we go to the archery, the woman who did archery, and she won a gold medal, and they said Chicago Bears lineman's wife wins the gold medal, and didn't even mention her name. So I think those gender roles is what play, like, now we're getting away from, like, sometimes the sexualization of female athletes to, like, that gender role where she could not have done that if it wasn't for her husband, so, or her mate, or that second fiddle to, 19th medal is amazing, but a world record is just as amazing and deserve that top headline as well.
Moving on, how are some ways the common stereotype that no one is interested in women's sports and that sex sells women's sports can be dismantled? Is there anything that comes to your mind?
In being a women's volleyball player, our uniform is particularly revealing. You know, you wear spandex and a very tight top and some knee pads and shoes as your uniform, and it's very, very revealing. And I often wondered, transitioning from a adolescent to a young adult, I just wanted to wear some sweatpants to play, because when you dive, you slide easier, it's more effective. Why in the world do we have to switch to spandex where our thighs have to stick to the floor as you're sliding and diving for a ball? It's just very counterintuitive to me. And the fact that that is the uniform and everyone does have to match, that is a very interesting dichotomy, that, function versus look. I definitely think that women's volleyball has that interesting dichotomy going for it, yeah.
Anything you would like to comment?
Well, in terms of the sport that I'm particularly interested in and research on, and that is soccer. And if you think of just over 10 years ago, the then Secretary General of FIFA, the International Soccer Federation, Sepp Blatter, said that women should be wearing more revealing shorts. So he was suggesting that this is a product which is going to be sold on the international market, and the way to sell this product is to sexualize the athletes. And fortunately, that preposterous proposal was rejected.
Oh, great.
Thankfully.
Yeah. It shouldn't be important. The look of it shouldn't be important. What should be important is the play that's ensuing.
Absolutely.
The beauty of the game that all the athletes originally played for. When you're a kid growing up in a sport, you play for the love of the game, creating plays in the game, not for how it might look. I think that comes in a little bit later as you are exposed to more of the societal issues that are, forced upon you to think about. Yeah.
Moving on, I think this question is more directed towards Chris, but I wanted to take a step back and reflect on the history of women in sports. How did women make this transition from not being able to wear pants during the 1920s to playing professional sports?
Well, I think women have always played sports. If we go back to the original ancient Olympic Games, you had Olympic Games or events for women only. So women have always played. When we talk about organized sports, so if we talk about organized football or baseball or basketball, which are all really sort of 19th century, early 20th century inventions, women were playing these games. Women have always played these games. But women have always, and again, it goes back to this point that I don't want to stress too much, but I think it's important, is that women are always seen as secondary. Women are always seen as supplementary. Women are always seen as behind the scenes. so an example that I use with my students when I teach courses on sport and society, the first question I always ask my students is, who is the #1 soccer player in the world, and which is the #1 soccer team in the world? And every response is, it's Lionel Messi, who is a man, and it's Barcelona, who is a men's team. Nobody thinks about Abby Wambach, for example, the fact that she scored the most international goals in US soccer history. Nobody refers to the fact that the US women's national team has won the World Cup on 3 occasions. So it's the way that I think we as society, we as sports people and people studying sport, we need to challenge this, but we also need to write these histories. We need to show that there have been women involved in sports for generations, for centuries, I would argue.
Moving on, would women's sports have the standing they occupy now without Title IX? And this is open to all of you.
I'm not so sure that the public as a whole would have gone towards that direction. I do think that the more higher professional people that are within the universities, within these organizations that implemented Title IX, I think it is because of their influence and their more futuristic thinking that it is implemented, because I do not think that as a public we would have all seen that. Most definitely probably because athletics tend to be a male-dominated organization in terms of CEOs and owners and things like that. So because it's so male-dominated from the top, it would be more difficult to, as a public, divert from that.
I would agree with that. I would agree with that. I think sometimes change requires law, and it requires sometimes some enforcement, because even now in 2016, every university, every high school, every junior high school has not embraced the equal teams or the equal play for women. So I think without that, we would not see the rise in women in sports. We would not see, like, and I keep referring to the Olympics, and it's close to my heart.
Yeah.
But the women's team at the Olympics won more gold. As a country, they would have won the Olympics, just the American women. So that just kind of puts things into perspective.
I think Title IX is crucial, and particularly in the US context. But if we look at before the introduction of Title IX in 1972, or the signing of Title IX in 1972, if we look at all the coaches of women's teams at that stage, the overwhelming majority of these coaches were female. However, if we look at the coaches of particularly Division I female teams today, the overwhelming majority of these coaches are men. And the question that I have is, why is that the case? I would argue that it's because there's so much money in NCAA athletics that men are being selected over women in many instances because they're big salaries to be earned, suggesting that, well, yes, we can have this equality, but when it comes to the decision making, when it comes to the coaching, when it comes to training of players and teams, men are the ones that can do it better than women.
And that's interesting. Just from playing club volleyball, I now coach club volleyball on the boys' side and the girls' side. And in the finals, in the National Junior Olympic finals for boys volleyball, and this is not collegiate, but it's still an important point because these athletes are to become collegiate athletes. And it was a huge shock to everyone in the stands that the finals had one of the teams had a female head coach and a male assistant coach. And it came to a huge surprise to a lot of the audience members, and that team actually ended up winning the national championships, and all of those players ended up playing in a university level volleyball.
I think as being in collegiate athletics and being an administrator, women are not as encouraged for coaching to be the next step in their career. And that's similar to because in most male sports, there's a post-collegiate career you can aspire to, whether it's professional sports. For women, and most post-collegiately, you have to go to Europe, or there are not that many opportunities to play post-collegiately in the United States. So past college, you're not influenced or encouraged to pursue a career in athletics past your graduation date on a team. And I think that has a lot to do with coaches. And then we have men who are growing up. My dad was a coach. I was always on the field. I was always in the gym. I was always with my father when he was coaching. And now we're just starting now to see where women are bringing their kids to see their moms coach. And that's because of Title IX. So I think as we continue to grow, we will see more and more women coaches because they've been in it since they were like 3 and 4 years old, if we compare it to like little boys who've been in it too.
Yeah.
Dawn, you mentioned the Olympics, and we did ask a couple of students questions on campus. And you know, a lot of people saw their first female athletes on the Olympics, watching these Olympic Games. Here is what CSUN student has to say.
There are many sports that I feel like women excel at, like gymnastics, volleyball, and many sports like this in which I would prefer to see the women's.
During the Olympics, there tends to be more media coverage of female athletes in these sports, which are volleyball, gymnastics, swimming, and track and field. And as he mentioned himself, the student, that he prefers to watch women play these sports. Why do you think this is?
Oh man, I think it has mostly to do with the uniform. It's going back to, you know, sexualizing the athlete from the uniform. And I actually have this discussion all the time with my former teammates who I played with at University of the Pacific. And, you know, our men's program at UOP was discontinued because of the lack of funds that it was bringing into the school, and amongst other reasons, I guess we needed to add another men's sport because we had switched conferences. So there were other issues there too, but our men's program was amazing to watch. And men's volleyball is such a powerful, dynamic game, and it's very entertaining, and it brings a new site of volleyball that not everybody gets to see in the female side of things. It's just a different strategy, different things are appreciated about the game, which is beautiful. As a coach, it's awesome to watch. And for some reason, people don't gravitate towards that male side of watching volleyball, and I do think it has to do with the uniform. The rules are the same, the volleyball is the same, the strategy is different, which is awesome and exciting, but for some reason they aren't appreciating both.
I think it's because those sports that the young men mentioned, gymnastics, volleyball, track and field, have historically been, women have not been shut out of those sports. Like, women have been encouraged to be in gymnastics. If you think back to the 70s, women were encouraged to run track. They've been running track since the 60s and 70s. In gymnastics since the 50s and 60s, you know, women's volleyball, those are sports that women are encouraged to participate in, so they often excel. If you, for example, the NBA is 55 to 60 years old. The WNBA is only 20 years old. So how do we play catch up there to make them both equal in viewership and demand from the public?
Do you like to say anything about this?
Well, I think the question that we should possibly be asking is, why do we have gendered sport in the first place? Should we not be talking about having non-gendered sport? So if somebody is good enough, irrespective of their male or female, to play on a team. If we look at some of the times in track, for example, in marathon running, they're not that far off. And I think if we have a level playing field of sorts and we open it up to competition on the basis of being a human rather than being a man or a woman, I think we could move into some interesting spaces and interesting discussions more generally.
Okay. I'd like to conclude this panel with my last question, which is, how does media representation and coverage of female athletes in the media affect kids?
Well, I think that's like anything. I think we have to be careful with what we put on television for our children, regardless of gender or sport. But I think seeing women in more powerful positions as athletes, and it goes back to what did I see growing up, right? What did my peer group see growing up versus maybe your peer group may have seen women in sports. And this young man is in his 20s, and this is the first time he's seen a female athlete was on the Olympic stage. So I think it's just as Title IX, thank goodness for Title IX, and as we continue to grow, we'll see more women in those powerful images. But I think that society, that's hard to see women in an image, in that image of power and authority that sometimes sports entails.
I think images are crucial, and we have to consider how they're represented. And if we go back to the US women's soccer team, I think there are probably 2, maybe 3 of the players who don't have shoulder length hair. And for me, thinking as a professional athlete, having really long hair, I wonder how practical is that? So I think women are still expected to look a certain way. And if young girls are seeing this, I wonder whether they can question it. I wonder whether they can actually eventually challenge that and say, no, we're not prepared to be represented in a way that is sexualized, that is over-feminized. We want to be seen as athletes. We want to be judged as athletes and nothing else.
Would you like to weigh in?
I mean, it's just a very lofty topic. And yes, like you said, images are a very powerful thing. And I guess for me, the most important thing is that you as an individual lead your life in a way that you're proud of, regardless of what social norms tell you. I know a lot of my teammates and I, we aspire to be coaches at a high level one day, and to us, talking and sharing that with each other is a normal thing. And I guess, you know, just surrounding yourself with people who have that aspiration and continuing to spread that aspiration is possible in the lay public is a important thing to add.
Well, I'd like to thank you all for being here today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for having
Thank
us.
you.
When I was in foster care, I never knew when I would have to move, so I always had my suitcase ready to go. Then one day, I was adopted. My new parents opened their hearts and home to me. My parents cook my favorite breakfast for me every morning. My parents take me on trips I never thought I would go on. They gave me a home and an even better reason to use that suitcase. My parents aren't perfect, but they're perfect for me.
Dad's home!
The smallest moments can have the biggest impact on a child's life. Take time to be a dad today.
You guys going to my party on Friday?
Yeah, dude, it's gonna be crazy.
All right.
What's up, dude? I'm loving your jacket.
Don't be such a fag.
If you don't mean it, why say it? Words hurt. Think before you speak.
Hey there, Mrs. Carter. You can earn over 10% on your money if you deposit your savings into our investment program.
You are lucky sweepstakes winner.
Mrs.
Just
Carter,
enter your
Grandma,
contact
enter your
information
checking
and
account
your
information.
winnings will
Grandma,
be
it's
mailed
me.
to
Please
you.
help me. I'm stuck in Ohio and my wallet was stolen. Please send me some money so I can get home.
Millions of people, especially seniors, are targeted every day by an array of fraudulent scams through online technology. Please be aware.
People think I'm trash, but they're wrong. Today I'm just an aluminum can, but one day I could be a stadium.
Thank you for watching On Point. You can follow us on social media by searching CSUN On Point. You can watch us on LA 36 Sunday mornings at 11:30, and you can listen to us at KCSN 88.5 FM, also on Sunday mornings at 5:30. For all of us here at On Point, I'm Jackie Wawee.